Good morning. It's my honor today to welcome you to the 24th Annual Louise McBee Lecture. The lecture series is hosted by the Institute of Higher Education, where Dr. McBee was a faculty member. And during her career as a university administrator, Dr. McBee was known by everybody as a hands-on administrator who affected change and pushed this university in a very positive direction, whether that was hiring more female faculty members or promoting equitably women in rank and salary at this institution. She used her steady hands to move this institution forward, often during some very challenging times, where this institution was adversely affected by world events, sometimes student protests, and sometimes major academic controversies. Throughout all of those challenges, Louise McBee stood there as a person of integrity and as a person that knew how to keep this institution going forward in a positive direction. She was renowned throughout her career as an effective and forthright administrator who demonstrated in every decision that integrity and fairness would drive whatever decision she made. Louise McBee carried that reputation forward after she retired from this institution and began a second career in politics as our state representative. And in the Georgia General Assembly, she was an effective representative. She chaired the Higher Education Committee of the House of Representatives, and she won re-election repeatedly in this district until she decided to retire in 2004. There's a whole lot more I could say about Louise McBee if we had time today, but I would refer to you the biography that gives you highlights of her career that's in the program. And at this point, I would just ask everyone to join me in expressing our thanks and appreciation to Louise McBee. Louise, thank you. Well, the annual Louise McBee Lecture is the highlight of this academic fall. We have a number of key university events, but perhaps none that people look forward to more than this particular lecture. And so it's with great excitement that we look forward to today's speaker, because some of the most prominent figures in higher education have been previous Louise McBee lectures. You'll find their names in your program. This year, we have another distinguished individual to join that list of accomplished speakers, someone who has literally written the book on the history of American higher education. And so at this time, let me call Vice Provost Libby Morris, who also serves as the director of the Institute of Higher Education, forward, and she will introduce our speaker. Libby?
Thank you, Provost Moorhead. Good morning. It's a wonderful day when you can spend time with Louise McBee. And I'm pleased that we can spend time with her today, and that the Institute of Higher Education has the opportunity to host this lecture in her name. I'm pleased to introduce John Thelin, Professor of Higher Education and Policy at the University of Kentucky. This lecture is the most important event of the Institute of Higher Education, and we are pleased that John accepted our invitation, as he does join a distinguished list of accomplished educators and professionals who have given this lecture previously. I want to begin by mentioning his career path, as noted in the program. He is a 1969 graduate of Brown University, where he concentrated in European history and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. He earned an MA in American history, a PhD in the history of education, and was a Regents Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to joining the University of Kentucky, he was on the faculties of Indiana University and the College of William and Mary. In 1969, Professor Thelin went to the University of Kentucky, where in 2000 he was named University Research Professor. John is both an outstanding teacher and researcher, and he has won numerous awards in both areas. In 2004, he received the Great Teacher Award from the University of Kentucky Alumni Association. In 2006, he was awarded the UK Provost Award for Teaching Excellence. In 2011, John received the Outstanding Research Achievement Award from the Association for the Study of Higher Education. John has received 2 major grants from the Spencer Foundation, one to study the history of intercollegiate athletic scandals, that led to his books, Games Colleges Play, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And in 1999-2000, he did a historical study of how research universities developed in the South since 1890. He is the author of 6 books, and he also has published in such scholarly publications and journals as the Review of Higher Education, the Journal of Higher Education, History of Education Quarterly, as well as Academe and Change. He has chapters in the Encyclopedia of American Social History, the Encyclopedia of Higher Education, and he has written for the popular press, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. John's book, A History of American Higher Education, published in 2004 by the Johns Hopkins University Press, was updated and reissued in 2011. In reviewing the book, our own UGA University professor and former director of the Institute of Higher Education, Tom Dyer, wrote, "This is a splendid book. By far the best to appear on the subject since the 1962 publication of Frederick Rudolph's The American College and University. John Thelin's work will supplant Rudolph's as the dominant overview of the history of American higher education. Comprehensive but not encyclopedic, Thelin's account is interspersed with lively anecdotes and a creative emphasis on cultural history that will keep the attention of readers. It is a tour de force." Professor Dyer was correct. This book has been adopted by every major PhD program in higher education nationwide, including Harvard, Stanford, Vanderbilt, Indiana, Cornell, University of Georgia, Penn State, and the list goes on. The book is now being translated by the Beijing University Press for graduate programs in China. Not only is Professor Thelin a productive scholar and an exemplary instructor, he enjoys being part of the academic community. He has served twice on UK presidential task forces, and he has been elected a member of the University Senate and the Graduate Council. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome noted historian and friend of the Institute of Higher Education to the podium, Professor John Thelin. His topic today is academic procession, presidents and professors from past to present. Thank you, John, for being here. Thank you so much for being here.
Call security. It's not advancing?
Yeah, click the laptop button. Click it.
Yeah, I am.
Uh-oh. There you go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Today, I'd like you to join me as we're participants and observers in the academic procession. Now, not only past and present, but also into the future. And we pick up the procession. Notice it's difficult to tell among this colorful assembly who are the professors and who are the presidents, because the roles are fluid, and above all, they're partners, and they march together. Before picking up this story, we need some geographic context. In 1953, the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, visited Dartmouth College. I think this was in May. And upon arriving at Dartmouth, he stepped out of his presidential limousine and said, "Why, this is how I have always thought a campus should look." Well, I like Ike, and I certainly don't want to get into any presidential debates. We've had enough. But allow me to counterbalance. Whenever my wife Sharon and I arrive in Athens, we get out of our non-presidential sob and say, "This is how we have always thought a campus should look." Now we have to choose. I invoke favorite son of Kentucky, Henry Clay. How would he resolve this dispute, this difference of opinion? What I say is, to President Eisenhower, I'd rather be right than president. So obviously, the balance shifts in favor of the University of Georgia. Yes, a place where past and present are animated, where landscaping of modern and historic buildings create what I would call a wonderful stage set. And the best is yet to come. It's not only the campus and the landscaping, but it is the cast that animates the University of Georgia. This is a place where history matters, but it matters in a relevant way, making a better present and future. And that is why, for example, the honor is mine that we are here to honor Dr. Louise McBee, who has made this lecture possible. And I look over the audience, and I see, for example, my dear colleagues from the Institute of Higher Education, Libby Morris, longtime colleagues Jim Hearn and Tom Dyer. And this morning, I was put through my paces by yet another cohort of excellent doctoral students who are learning their critical and argumentative skills as they played Get the Guest. And I look over our numerous colleagues, and I think of the conversations and panels, and I think of Doug Thoma, and numerous colleagues who have been very dear to me over the years. But let us move on. We use this as our setting. Here's the University of California logo, and the reason this is pertinent is that while we were assembling, I wasn't the only one who was impressed by the people who were attending. The fire marshal came over to me and said, "We have a problem. There's an overconcentration of talent that puts us in violation of the Athens Fire Code." And so my pledge was that if he allowed me to give my talk, one, I would agree to stay within the time limit. Second is that under the condition that we would generate light and not heat. So hence, the University of California, if you look carefully on the logo, the motto says, "Let there be light." So that is the inspiration as we start our academic procession. The University of California is also a good place to start because it helps me to make a point that we often take for granted about our heritage of American higher education. In 1849, the president of the California Constitutional Convention applauded a proposal to create a new state university. And in a flush of pride, he exuberantly said to his colleagues, "Why should we send our sons and daughters to Europe to finish their education? If we have the means here, we can procure the necessary talent. We can bring the president of Oxford. Bring him here by offering a sufficient salary." Now, there were some stumbling blocks in this optimistic quest. Put aside money, travel, compensation packages, and the fact that the University of California would not open for another 20 years. The essential problem still was that Oxford University had no president. The role did not exist. So this leads me back even further. An essential, enduring, distinctive feature of American higher education, whether it be in the colonial period or later as we become the United States, was the historic and innovative provision that colleges and universities made explicit for creating and supporting a strong presidential office, accompanied in tandem with a strong external board of trustees. We take this for granted, but it was not inevitable, and it remains a very, very unique arrangement in higher education worldwide. Here's Oxford University. Once again, another important landmark in that we owe so much of our structure and legal incorporation and charters to the traditions of Oxford and Cambridge University. And indeed, we did transplant those structures and those legal formats to the New World, but with some very, very important differences in how we filled in the details of carrying out the charters. Let me proceed. This is not a provost. This is Henry VIII, who enters into academic history swiftly and unexpectedly. You may recall in his disputes over the legality of his marriages and his quest for an heir to the throne, he relied mightily on the canon law faculty at Oxford University. However, when they were unable to provide him a legal brief that gave him justification to nullify his marriages, in one fell swoop, he dissolved the law school faculty. So here we are looking at Oxford as our spiritual base for American higher education. And what I see is they have no president, and now they have no faculty. Now, this makes this a very, very short talk. But let me see if I can rescue this. What happens is that when we go forward to the New World, to the American colonies, and here's the College of William and Mary in Virginia, chartered in 1693, what happens is that although we rely on Oxford and Cambridge for our legal shape and framework for our institutions, in fact, Oxford became Exhibit A for what the colonial colleges did not wish to be. First of all, at Oxford, professors were running the show. So that was definitely something to avoid. So let's take a look at the original charter of the College of William and Mary. And if you see on page 37, line 12, one of the things they do is they really do state explicitly that the president has strong administrative power and reports only to the Board of Visitors, does not report to the faculty. Now, there appears to be some provision for including faculty because, after all, they do create an academic senate. However, if you read closely in the charter, the academic senate is defined as being one and the same as the Board of Visitors. So what we have is a very, very strong executive and board arrangement that allows very little formal provision for faculty in terms of shared governance. And that, I think, has been a hallmark of American higher education since the 17th century. And here is one of the benefactors of this was James Blair. Although he was probably opposed to faculty tenure, he had no objections when the Board of Visitors named him president for life. And also, he was the only member of the William and Mary community to have grazing rights for his cows on the campus. Let's jump ahead into the heroic era of American higher education, what I would call a procession of presidents and problems, the period around 1890 to 1910. And I want to comment on some selected legendary presidents. But I want to make the point that although my emphasis is on presidents, always bear in mind that I see professors as part of the procession, and there's a great interdependence between presidents and professors. But we have this now tradition of strong presidents in American colleges and universities. Now, if you're going to march in an academic procession, a good way to do it is to have John D. Rockefeller Sr. As your marching partner. And here we have William Rainey Harper, the founding president of the University of Chicago, with the major donor, John D. Rockefeller Sr., who endowed the University of Chicago probably with as great a fortune as any American university of that era. Now, William Rainey Harper was a prodigy, graduating from college at the age of 16. He spoke 8 classical languages. Unfortunately, there was no one to whom he could speak with 6 of them. But also, he was a master in terms of university building and outreach to the Chicago business community. He also had a strong influence on faculty in that he was largely responsible for designing the elaborate structure of ranks and departments, promotion of assistant, associate, and full professor, and so on. And he carried this structural bureaucratic genius to an extreme. He was always lively about it and enthusiastic, so much so that it was sometimes hard to distinguish the academic procession from his own funeral procession, because at the age of 47, on his deathbed, he was not at all gloomy about his prospects, but rather spent his last days designing an elaborate funeral procession which required all faculty to wear full academic regalia. And so in a sense, everybody did go away happy. Sometimes presidents don't march with professors. They march with other presidents. And once again, in deference to Tom Dyer, who's done definitive work on Theodore Roosevelt, here we have the Charter Day ceremony at the University of California in the early 1900s, with President Roosevelt joining President Benjamin I. Wheeler. Now, this raises a question of protocol and diplomacy. University presidents, how do they address and interact with presidents of the United States? Well, here they seem to be on rather equal footing. But there's an example where President William Howard Taft of the United States visited Harvard University. And while waiting in the anteroom, the secretary said, "Mr. Taft, President Eliot will see you now." David Starr Jordan, probably rehearsing his talk before the McBee lecture in an earlier era. But presidents did have some problems with professors. But in fact, what I find in this age of heroic presidents, that actually it was undergraduates who preoccupied and tended to make their life downright miserable at times. David Starr Jordan had come to the presidency of Stanford, coming from Indiana University. He was originally an ichthyologist. And after a very long afternoon welcoming freshmen at the orientation reception, he complained to one of his colleagues that every time he remembered the name of a new student, he forgot the name of a fish. And this did not bode well for his return to the faculty. These are the bright young men of 1910. In the center is William Howard Taft. Having been rebuffed at the president's office at Harvard, he returned to the academic procession at his alma mater, Yale. He's center stage. And to his left, to our right, is the president of Yale, Arthur Hadley. And they appear to be marching to a good drum, doing well. But I want to go back to my theme of how problematic students were to even the great presidents of this era. And here's an excerpt from a student yearbook at Yale, where President Hadley was in office. This was a boast. It said, "Never since the heavenly host, with all the Titans fought, saw they a class whose scholarship approached so close to naught. there actually was a competition between the sophomore class and the junior class as which could have the lower grade point averages. And so it's interesting, our nostalgia, for an era in which we think that elite colleges had no problems. President Hadley would probably disagree. Part of our academic procession, a famous member, is Woodrow Wilson. This is a photograph of him as president of Princeton University on his way to his final commencement as president of Princeton. I find it actually a sad photograph. The reason being is that although we are very aware of him as an iconic figure who today defines Princeton University and its educational ideals, what we overlook is that even the great presidents in their own lifetime, in their own service, faced a great deal of uncertainty and often setbacks. That in fact, Woodrow Wilson, he would leave Princeton to go on to be governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States. But he did not leave on happy terms. He actually had lost two decisive confrontations or issues with students and with faculty. One dealt with his attempts to reform what were called the eating clubs that were known for social snobbery, and he faced a great deal of pushback, not only from students but from alumni. And also he did not have the support of his faculty or the Board of Trustees in his vision for a graduate school at Princeton. So it's important to note that even the great presidents faced problems. Now, he did make an interesting contribution to academic notions of shared governance. When he was president-elect of the United States, he visited the Senate, and he was standing up in the gallery looking down on the floor discussions and filibusters and debates. And he turned to a colleague and on a side and said, watching the Senate, he said, "Compared to the Princeton Faculty Club, the senators are amateurs when it comes to politics." One thing I want to keep in mind with these snapshots of some of these great presidents during the heroic age of university building is we keep in mind how in about a century the complexity of our universities and the complexities of being a president have been transformed. Look at how small the enrollments are. Particularly today, we think of, for example, universities in the Southeast Conference or in the Big Ten. It's not unusual to have an enrollment of 35,000, or I think Minnesota is probably 50,000, as is Ohio State. Look at these numbers. The largest headcount enrollment is just a little bit over 5,000. And we look down, we see our great state universities still remain rather small. So that we're going to see a transformation in both in terms of faculty roles and also presidential roles, with complexity, added missions, and a number of other complications. And another way of depicting this, one of the concerns in 1910 was our universities had become a PhD octopus, preoccupied with graduate studies. But these are 10-year totals of the number of PhDs that universities conferred. Whereas today, it would not be unusual for a major research university to confer somewhere between 200 and 500 PhDs. Yet the comparisons from a century ago where even the most prolific PhD program might produce something like 40 PhDs a year. So the complexity and growth and success of American universities in the past century remains not only important, but also it complicates the role of both presidents and professors. And as we leave this era, this captures the continual battle that presidents faced in trying to nurture some kind of intellectual culture. And this was a poster that appeared widespread in university dormitory rooms at the turn of the century. The motto, and students learn this lesson well: don't let your studies interfere with your education. Now, given this climate, not only was it not particularly a strong academic culture, and by the way, here's a portrait, a picture from the early 1900s of undergraduates hard at study. Many seem to have followed me into my classrooms, at least their grandchildren. It shows you how pervasive the problem of gaining the serious attention of students. And in addition to rather lax academic standards, the American campus for most undergraduates was not at all a hotbed of political radicalism. Now, Marxism did make an entree into the American college university in the 1930s, but with an interesting twist. Groucho Marx was the closest, and he's addressing, but it appears to be the junior faculty sitting behind him, but at fictitious Huxley University. And in his inaugural address, the theme was whatever proposal presented by the faculty, unanimously he said, time and time again, "I am against it," which brought applause from the trustees, but not from the professors. There is a serious change in the American university presidency in the 1930s. I depict here, to the left, is Herman B. Wells, president of Indiana University, starting in the early 1930s. He will serve about 30 years. What is important about Herman Wells is that, first of all, he represents a pronounced shift of academic energy and educational growth into the state universities, and in this case, the state universities of the Midwest. The other thing that's interesting is that he had no aspiration or pretense to being a great scholar. He was a professor in their School of Business, but his route to the presidency was a very interesting one. At the height of the Great Depression, his knowledge of the state banking system allowed him to work with the governor and the legislature and banks within the state to save the state's economy and banking system. And what happened was, in genuine kind of bipartisan gratitude for his service to the state and his trust, they named him president of Indiana University. And it was a very interesting choice because he was not a great scholar and made no claim to be. But what he did have was the love and commitment of an alum to his alma mater of State University. And what will happen over 30 years is the most interesting growth of creating a great state university in a state that was not affluent, was not wealthy. And it was interesting, some things that he would do, I think that were very, very imaginative and deserves our applause, is that when he would go to the state legislature, one, he would insist on joining arm in arm with the president of Purdue University, the land-grant institution of Indiana, and they would together march unified down the aisle and address the opening session of the legislature, rather than fighting over scarce resources. The other thing that he did was he always made the case for steady, stable funding. He said, we do not want boom and bust. What we want is a sustained partnership between the state and the state university. He then supplemented that by understanding the importance of private philanthropy, where he would cultivate, for example, the Studebaker family or the Lilly family in pharmaceuticals. He would rely on their donations, starting in the 1930s and continuing, that the way to achieve a margin of excellence in a state university was through the private philanthropy. This would allow you to have the libraries, the music performing arts centers, museums, these things that truly made a university great, but that might not always come from the base state budget. Another thing he did, and this is where the partnership of presidents and professors becomes very, very important, he understood that for Indiana University to compete for faculty talent was difficult, competing against the established Ivy League in the East Coast. What he did was he kept an eye on international problems. For example, in the 1930s, it would be displaced scholars who had been run out of German universities. He would provide them a home at Indiana University. Later on, after World War II, where Indiana University is allowed to become a great center of Eastern European Studies. Largely, he did this by attracting and welcoming and encouraging emigre scholars from the Soviet Union. They were appreciative, and so at faculty meetings they would say in a range of languages that in fact we are all Hoosiers. I mentioned earlier that the University of California was not able to woo away the president of Oxford University because Oxford University has no president. Well, by the 1930s, they get around to finding an excellent president. And here he is on the cover of Time magazine, Robert Sproul. Once again, he's very much like Herman Wells in that he represents an alum of the State University at a time when they were relatively small and did not have a lot of money. His background was in accounting. And so he combined this passion and loyalty of the alum with the sharp eye on budgets and finance of an accountant. And it was a fascinating, interesting chemistry that came together. Also, interesting tribute to the importance of the undergraduate experience. We talked about the academic procession. He also marched as the drum major for the University of California Marching Golden Bears. And following behind playing the clarinet was his classmate Earl Warren, who would go on to be governor of California and then later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But one of the innovations that Sproul brought about when Earl Warren was governor of California was to have him sit on the 50-yard line at all home games for the University of California. So it was the idea of these numerous alliances between a state university, its state government, athletics, and these things that made the state university truly a jewel in the crown. And I mentioned here also from Time magazine, the University of California was really on a roll with presidents. Robert Sproul's successor, Clark Kerr. And I'll come back to Clark Kerr in a little bit, but he makes the cover of Time magazine in the early 1960s for the California Master Plan, and this idea of how is it as a nation we construct some worthy strategies that sends a nation to college to try to make higher education accessible, not only to the mass level, but also to universal higher education, and also at an affordable price. So he becomes very famous, and some of his designs and plans become the marvel, not only of the United States, but internationally as well. But what I like about him was his good wit. And when he was retired, he looked back on his presidency at the University of California. He said he came into the job as he left it, fired with enthusiasm. Shift into the immediate World War II period. Once again, notice the succession of presidents, university presidents, who are worthy of making the cover of Time magazine. This was an era when university presidents were important not only in higher education, but in the national arena as well. Now, if you notice Robert Maynard Hutchins, the setting for this photograph of him is the wonderful Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago. Now, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was Baptist, and yet he provided money for a medieval Gothic cathedral, a kind of interesting ecumenical blend. Well, this chapel was the site of Robert Hutchins' very, very legendary observation. He was hosting a group of international visitors, and he's showing them the outside of the chapel. And then they went in, probably standing right where he is, and they were saying, well, this is, President Hutchins, this is just wonderful that you have incorporated religion and spiritual values into the life of the undergraduate culture. And fact is always better than fiction. Hutchins thought, he turned to the group, he said, well, yes, that is true, but my estimate is that for undergraduates at the university, this chapel is a site where more souls have been conceived than saved. But to external relations, it becomes very serious and very important in that Robert Maynard Hutchins, and then I'll follow with another president, became one of the foremost defenders of academic freedom in the late 1940s and early 1950s, at a time when university faculty were under great duress for loyalty oaths, for a number of restrictions and censorship on their work. Robert Maynard Hutchins was one of the champions. And my point being is that professors do need to acknowledge those presidents who have been their champions, who have been those defenders. Without presidents such as Hutchins, we would not have academic freedom as we know it. And let me join him with, I think, an underappreciated president, also from the early 1950s, also Time magazine. This is a young president of Harvard, Nathan Pusey. Fascinating in that his background was in classics. He was the son of a Congregationalist minister. He had been president of a small liberal arts college in Wisconsin. And he was called to the presidency of Harvard. And he'd had no experience in fundraising. But what he realized early in his tenure, that fundraising was the need for the university. And so he put aside his own interests to plunge into what was needed by the institution. And most important, he, along with Hutchins, became one of the true defenders of academic freedom and essentially put his career on the line in order to protect and defend his faculty. And it's important to note this because in the 1960s, he would fall from favor with a generation of undergraduates. And what I find sad is that how soon they forgot what dedication he showed to essential academic values, but a later generation forgets. Moving into the 1960s, once again, from many, many excellent presidents, here's one that some of our graduate students may have read as an economist. This is Howard Bowen, legendary for his research on human investment and the social worth of higher education. Also, what's been forgotten, he was a very courageous dean and president. He essentially was asked to leave being dean of the business school at University of Illinois because he insisted on hiring a faculty from a nationwide pool, breaking some of their provincialism. He would go on to teach at Williams College. He would be an economist with the federal government. And then he would go on to be president of Grinnell College, then finally president of the University of Iowa. And one of his most admiring colleagues was the president of Iowa State University, who always pointed out that Howard Bowen did things as a president that were truly for the good of the university and for the good of the state. And one of the things he did was help Iowa State University flourish in companion with the University of Iowa. And interesting, in retirement at Claremont Graduate School, he would serve 1 year as president there, but then he would turn later in his career to his really seminal writing on the economics of higher education. And as every president now knows, what he called his revenue theory was that every university raises all the money it can, and every university spends all the money it raises, so that the yin and yang balances. It's never enough. One thing that we forget is the period from around 1971 to about 1985, I consider to be one of the most stressful in terms of American higher education, in terms of financial problems. Now, one reason I'm so honored to be presenting the McBee lecture is I was preceded by Hannah Gray, then the president of the University of Chicago. And I think she was trying to show graphically to her faculty that cutting budgets could be fun of sort. But in fact, she was very, very tough-minded. And she also brought back football to the University of Chicago. But she was a superb historian, never had planned to go into administration, but in fact helped the University of Chicago through a very, very hard period and to right themselves in terms of their finances and to clarify their mission. Well, I've talked mostly about presidents with passing mention of faculty. And so I wonder, where are our faculty? Are they lost and found? How can we bring them into this procession a little bit more? Well, my solution, and Mr. Provost, I want you to take good notes on this. I have found for you the perfect professor. If you manage to stay awake during introductory philosophy, you may remember Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism. Lesser known is that he also was quite wealthy and very generous. He was a very, very generous donor to the University of London. As with all wise donors, he had a few conditions attached to his will and his bequest. The main one was that for perpetuity, he would be allowed to attend every faculty meeting of the University of London. So here he is, embalmed in a glass case. And every month they wheel him in. And if you and they dutifully record in the faculty minutes, Dr. Bentham, present, did not vote, did not speak. But he gave a lot. Ideal professor. Talk about the roles of presidents and professors. Go back about 5 years. This is Lawrence Summers, a very distinguished economist and president of Harvard. I do think, on a serious note, the Board of Trustees at Harvard did ask him to resign from the presidency of Harvard after a very, very contentious, prolonged episode. And I think the insight that I would draw is that formal structures of faculty governance, such as senates and whatnot, are very diverse in their influence. What is important is the culture of the faculty within an institution. And the irony is that Lawrence Summers was a very distinguished scholar. He had been a professor. He had also served in the cabinet and whatever, a number of government roles. I think that what was his undoing was at some point he did not respect and heed and listen to collective faculty. And at some point, all the votes of confidence of a board of trustees, at some point, if a president does not enjoy the confidence and support and respect of the collective faculty through informal arrangements, it's very, very difficult to lead. In marked contrast, I go back to an episode from this summer at the University of Virginia, where Teresa Sullivan, this is her being sworn in as president of the University of Virginia, an amazing episode in academic history where the Board of Visitors had asked for her resignation. But we know that professors are never around during the summer. But how is it that an informal, spontaneous groundswell of 2,000 faculty and staff gathered on the lawn to show their support for their president? Kind of interesting variation on how presidents and their faculties interact. And I'm very indebted to the University of Georgia Institute of Higher Education for Joe Hermanowitz of Sociology Department, who I think wrote one of the most prescient books about the academic profession. It was published in 2011, and probably written a little bit before that. And he asked Teresa Sullivan to be a contributing author to his anthology. Let me read from this and how timely it was and how unfortunate that the University of Virginia Board of Visitors had not taken time to read Joe's book and Teresa's essay. Teresa writes, as funding becomes tighter and as the timeline for decision-making grows shorter, decision-making in the university is likely to become more centralized, with fewer opportunities for input. Under these conditions, administrators are likely to become less reliant on professors and more reliant on specialists in finance. But she went on to say, for a healthy university, faculty input was crucial and was the key. And she felt that it was going to be increasingly in jeopardy and under threat. What was interesting in her urging reattention to the role of faculty, she built in a plank that reminded the faculty that with this power came great responsibility. She wanted them to come centrally into the fold of shared governance and to do so responsibly and beyond their own parochial interest. And so that is why I see this episode as so distinctive and very, very interesting as universities realign themselves and their governance in the 21st century. So, here we pick up the academic procession. We wrap up this wonderful event, and we saw the procession coming towards us a while ago. Now we see them marching away, and my question is, where are they going? Now, some may be going to renew their membership in the AAUP. Others may be going to start their membership in AARP. But in either way, what I am concerned about is not so much an incumbent generation of faculty, but what is going to be the future of the faculty and what then will be their shared governance as we renegotiate with presidents for what I call higher education's New Deal of the 21st century. I have raised the questions. I look to you for solutions. Thank you so much.